Hi everyone, welcome back to the Prof Unpad Podcast, where psychology meets reality. I am your host for today, Andika Dipurnama from Master's Batch 2024, and I am incredibly honored to be here also. And today we are going to talk about in depth about something that is probably very close to us, and to varying extent, it's something that we experienced before. It has happened to us previously in our life. It's a phenomenon where we are excluded, where we are ignored, when we are rejected. Today, we're going to talk in depth about social exclusion and coping. And I do think that it is very interesting because, to me, when we are talking about physical hurt, physical wound, it's basically simple for us to think that we want to cure that. We want to tend to the wound. We want to look for a medicine, for example. But it is what interests me is because when we are socially hurting because of, rejection, because of exclusion, and because of ignored or ignorance, our survival instinct often misfires. For example, instead of looking for an obvious cure in some sense for exclusion itself, like reconnecting, instead we become aggressive. And instead to seek support, look for support, we instead becomes more withdrawn in solitude or isolation. It's kind of ironic, isn't it? And it is an interesting thing to think about. And to navigate that complex human behavior, I am incredibly honored to be joined by Professor Dr. Ilja van Beest. And Professor Ilja is a professor of social psychology at Tilburg University, editor-in-chief for the journal Social Influence, a member of Society for Experimental Social Psychology, the European Association of Social Psychology, and the research director at the Kurt Lewin Institute. His research interest lies in the intricate mechanics of group processes, with a specific focus on coalition formation, conflict detection, ostracism, fairness, deception, trust, emotions, and symptom attribution. Once again, I am incredibly honored. Welcome, Professor Ilja, to our FOPSI podcast. How are you today?
I'm fine and very honored to be here as well.
Okay, so I mentioned very briefly about our topic today, social exclusion and also coping. Can you walk through us about the background of it? Like what is social exclusion, why social exclusion happened, and a lot of other things that you might, our listeners might want to know before we get into the nitty-gritty of the situation.
Well, I think the first thing that I want to talk about is the definition. And when we talk about exclusion, we often combine a lot of things together. And I think from a research perspective, it makes sense to distinguish between various forms. So at the highest level, I think we have exclusion. And at a somewhat lower level, you can say you're rejected, or you can say I'm ignored. And you kind of want to make a distinction between the two. And to me, the distinction is this. If I tell you I do not like you, I verbally indicate that I don't want you. So this is rejection at a more specific level. But if I just don't look at you, and just look a little bit like it, I'm ignoring you. And in the research, you often find that ignoring versus active rejection, there's a debate whether that is the same thing. And I think in the research that I've been part of, I would make a case that it's worthwhile to make a distinction between the two. And I would even argue that not looking at you, you're not even worthy of my attention, is worse than actively acknowledging your existence, but telling you I don't like you. So if I don't like you, you're still worthy of my attention. If I don't look at you, you're not even worthy of that. And that, to me, is, I think, an insight that over the years has gotten a lot of more attention. And it makes sense that to be void of any attention could be worse than punitive attention, because in the end, we're social animals. And negative attention, you're still part of the group at some level. But if that's gone as a social animal, it maybe is social death. And social death for social animals, in the end, might actually be real death.
Yes, it is indeed. From your explanation, I do think that we have a lot to cover then regarding social exclusion and how we react to social exclusion, because we also included coping in this topic for today. But I do think that in order to understand, in order to look for the cure, for example, in some sense to social exclusion, we have to understand the wound itself. As you said previously, that in also your researches, you state that social exclusion is inherently painful. It is a hefty statement to use, I feel like. Inherently painful. And it made me curious. Why is that social exclusion so inherently painful? You mentioned that it's because we are a social animal, but why is that the initial sting of social exclusion is inherently painful?
Yeah. Well, the answer, it's only by, how do you say that? Why is falling on your knee inherently painful? Why is being excluded inherently painful? Apparently, there's an adaptive system at work. If something is inherently painful, it motivates you to do something about it. And it motivates you to avoid it. So I think it's an evolutionary adaptive signal that highlights the importance of a particular phenomenon. So I would argue that if we would not be social animals, then being ignored or being excluded would not be painful. It's the consequence of being a social animal that we need an adaptive system that responds fast to signals that our socialness is threatened. So, to the extent that a social animal dies if it's out of the group, it's quite adaptive to have a system that picky rides on the perhaps earlier system of physical pain to respond fast to cues that you are not there. But I want to say a little bit more about that, because what I find interesting is how they have tested this analogy. So there are different ways in how you can go about it. So on the one hand, there are scholars that, for example, have looked at the biology of the pain system in your brain, and they have made the argument that the pain system that is used for physical pain is indeed also used for social pain. So if we put people in an fMRI machine, the same brain systems light up. I want to counter-argue there that there are also researchers that then look at different areas of the brain, and they find, yes, there is overlap, but there is also non-overlap. So what I would like to argue here, sure, I think we have evidence that physiologically there are similar processes at work, but we also have evidence that there are also different processes at work. So to me, the analogy is there, but is it 100%? No. Can you use it? Yes, and there are two ways. So some scholars have argued, and now I go directly to a cure, and a cure could be, for physical pain, could be taking a paracetamol, right?
Yes.
Or smoking hashish. These things have been known to sedate you and then also sedate physical pain. They have tried that also with social pain and found some evidence that to some extent it also lowers social pain. The more intriguing aspect about this relation is actually the other way around. If you have physical pain, you can do a band-aid on your wound.
Mhm.
But what we also typically do is give it a little kiss. You go to mama and you get a kiss on your mouth. So basically what she does, she gives a social cure for something that is physical. So we hug people that are in physical pain. So a social band-aid is used to cure a physical mishappening. And I think that is something that all of us recognize. That if you have physical pain, what do? Maybe you go to your loved ones and they comfort you. But think about non-social animals. Would they do that if they have physical pain? Go to another animal and be comforted or something? No, I think that's something specific of social animals.
That is something indeed specific for social animals. I think we can all relate to that. We have once, twice, many times come to our loved ones when we are sick physically. And we are not looking exactly for the cure for physical wound itself, but we want the social band-aid that you mentioned previously. And it's really interesting that it gives you the juxtaposition between physical and also the social. But if we were to compare between the two, between the distress from exclusion, for example, how does that compare to a physical pain like scraping your knee? Is it like it hurt more maybe because we are social animal, or is there any other explanation regarding that?
Yeah. Well, to me, like I said, there's overlap and also non-overlap. So there, I think, in the end, there is a qualitative difference between the two. But the analogy helps us. So, hurt feelings uses the language of physical feelings to describe a social pain. So the analogy is also in language in how we talk about belonging and not belonging. So there are many levels in which there is this analogy. The other thing that I think helps us to make sense of this is if it is indeed picky riding on the physical pain system, how we handle social pain, it also makes sense that we maybe over-report or over-detect. In other words, we make false positives. So if you want to avoid negative things, it's probably in your advantage to sometimes make a mistake. So if you see a threatening, if you see a pair of eyes in the jungle, your adaptive response should be to make the mistake that it could be a lion and start running. The non-adaptive response would be to always assume it's not a lion and not run. So what the system does is that we respond quickly to signals that were excluded, but also does make mistakes in that. So we actually could react to a setting as if we were excluded, but in reality we're not. But the point that I want to make here is that that is the consequence of having an adaptive system. If something is threatening or poisonous or whatever, then you should probably make the mistake. It is threatening when it's not, more often than the mistake it's not threatening when it actually was. So that's the analogy also there. And why I think this is important, because it means that as social animals, if you feel you were rejected, maybe in reality you were not. And that's something I think also maybe a cure, that you just realize we're social animals, we're probably a little bit sensitive to cues, even, and thus we make mistakes. So it's good to realize that if you feel bad because you were in a group and you felt excluded by the group, maybe you weren't. So one cure could be, maybe just ask the group, hey, I feel a little bit left out. is that correct?
Yeah.
And probably they will say, no, no, you're welcome.
okay.
You're okay. And that's, I think, another consequence. So realizing that we over detect.
I see. That is really interesting. Yeah, I mean, in a lot of cases, I think we understand the feeling of overthinking a cue that is not actually there. And well, yeah, you can kind of compare it to a certain extent. And that I do understand. And you mentioned also about when the response that we have, like immediately, like the initial. And I did a little bit of my homework about your researches. And in one of your research, I don't want to get it wrong here, so I'm just going to pull my notes about temporal resistance in the inherent pain of social exclusion. You mentioned that the immediate emotional distress of ostracism or exclusion is highly resistant. And that is something that from just the wording of it, from just the word of it, from the finding of it, I found very scary actually. So I would want to pose this question to you. Can anything truly eliminate or dampen the initial immediate distress caused by being excluded? And I think it would also be amazing if you could, for example, give us an image of like, how does that immediate distress feel and why is it so hard to soothe?
Yeah. Well, the analogy there, right? Again, it's the adaptive system. So according to Kip Williams, who came up with a model, a temporal model of how we respond to cues of being ignored. This model would argue that in the here and now, and he used the analogy of a candle and a flame. If you have a candle and a flame, it's put under your hand, you have a reflex, and the reflex is just pain.
Yeah.
And then it doesn't matter whether your mother is holding the candle or your enemy is holding the candle. It's a reflex.
It's a reflex, indeed.
And that analogy to him, and I think I buy that, works also for social pain. In the here and now, it's just a pain, a reflex. It's a pain response. Something is happening. And only a little bit later, you start thinking about, but why did this happen? Who is causing this? Have I handled this before? And then the coping kicks in. So the difference is, at the here and now, it's just pain. It's a reflex. It doesn't really matter whether it was actually a good thing or a bad thing for you. But more delayed, we do start thinking about why this has happened, who did it, and have I experienced this before? Does it make sense? Yes or no? And that then drives how we cope with it. But the other point, and that's extremely difficult, do we have real evidence for this? Well, to some extent, yes. But when I did a meta-analysis where we covered all the evidence that's out there on whether the immediate response cannot be moderated, because that's basically the idea. And in meta-analysis, we actually don't find support for the fact that it cannot be moderated, suggesting that even in the here and now, it does matter a little bit who is doing it to you. Mm. But the puzzle is still out there. I still buy it, that there's this distinction that, and it also kind of like makes logically sense, that we respond by pain and then respond by, but what is going on? Mm-hmm. To me, that's a logical thing. But we'll see whether future research will solve this puzzle more than we have so far.
I understand. Yeah, I think it is really interesting. And we talk a lot about how we respond physically regarding to that. And I feel like I do believe that it is also fascinating, especially that the idea that the initial distress is resistant to mitigation because only after that you think about it. because physically, like getting your hand a bit close to a candle, you immediately just give a response, like lashing back, right? And I do think that from your explanation as well, I feel like it suggests that this isn't just, even though it's a physiological thing about, and it's a social thing about social exclusion, it is also not just about a bruised ego when you are being excluded, when you are being rejected, when you are being ignored. But the response that you give is basically a built-in survival mechanism in action. If I could make that distinction, I feel like. And it is also interesting that in one of your research, you take this a step further about physiological responses, in which that you have found that this is not just a psychological event, but also a physical event as well. And I understand that you measure skin temperature in it. You measure face temperature in it. And for that, I would like to understand more on how does our body, like a candle to a flame probably, react to exclusion. Yeah, more details.
So what we try to do is, so to the extent that it is a reflex, the autonomous nervous system should be in play. And that does a lot. And I'm not a physiological scientist, but we had a colleague visiting us who did research using a thermal image camera. So that's a camera that basically is able to measure differences in heat, in temperature. And with that camera, you can also then see whether your finger temperature goes up or down, or your facial temperature goes up or down. You can also see whether your heart beats, whether your blood is pumping, because it all has to do with small differences in temperature. Why? Because blood flow. And blood flow goes to different areas of your face or subtracts from your skin. And that is regulated to some extent by your nervous system. So we had this idea that if we would look at the face and people would be threatened, and our threat was a social threat, there should be a response such that particular blood flows in the face would go to the core. Because that's the idea. If you're under threat, your body becomes ready for action. So blood goes to your core so that your heart and your muscles can work harder. So it actually means that blood from your extremities, for example your fingertips, goes away. So there was already research that showed that the fingertip decreases
in temperature,
providing evidence for this idea that indeed your body is getting ready for action. The face is a little bit difficult though. It was unclear whether the face is part of the core, so blood goes to the face, or not part of the core, so blood goes away from the face. And even more difficult, specific areas of the face could belong more to the core, whereas other areas could belong more to the extremity. So we didn't really have a clear prediction on what would happen, but we did have the prediction that would be more variability in the face as a consequence of exclusion relative to the normal state of a social animal, which is being included. So we compared being included to being excluded, and we actually observed an increased blood flow to the nose and this area, so that became warmer. And the funny analogy that I have, if you think about Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer, he is leading the pack. He's kind of like alone.
Kind of alone,
Well, maybe
he is excluded.
He's excluded.
Yeah, that is really interesting, because I mean, we do understand that, and we also, I think, feel it in our lives when we get excluded. And we are going to touch on this in a little bit. We get angry. We have like this aggressive response in ourselves, and then our face turned red, our face felt hot. I think that is a very, very interesting finding. And prior to that, I didn't make the connection. But now that I do, I would like to know as well, what are the practical implications? For example, that now we know that this is a physiological thing and could be measurable. And so, I would like to understand what is the practical implication of it.
Well, one practical implication, if we're, and now I'm going to take this to the extreme that I don't have tested, but one part of the reasoning why I think this facial signature is interesting is that if we're social animals, we are excluded. Maybe it's even visible to people that our face has more blood, becomes a little bit warmer, we blush a little bit. And if that is true, that would be a very adaptive signal, because that would mean that in social animals, I exclude you and I can see it in your face that I succeeded in doing that. Because then it becomes an adaptive circle, because then we can regulate how much I should exclude you to get across that you're doing something that I don't like. So exclusion, in a way, is a form of social punishment that groups can do to regulate the behavior of its members. But to be a true signal, then it should also be visible to the source that the message has landed. So for me, what I would like to do in research is to test whether people can actually see in the face of another individual that they are excluded. I haven't done the research, but my prediction would be that people probably can. And that would make a very interesting loop then. Right? Because then we respond in our physiology to threat, and this threat is then also visible by others.
Indeed it is. I think, that's an interesting loop to take a look into, and I am looking forward to look more and find out about your research about that next time. Okay, and I want to throw a little bit back into the notion that you mentioned about when we are having this analogy of having a candle close to your hand. It basically didn't really matter who holds the candle, if it's your mom or if it's your enemy, if it's your friend. Your physical reaction is going to be like lashing back. But in my due diligence in researching your researches, you also mentioned that there is an interesting distinction where autonomic response like that is stronger, as actually when the source of exclusion, the actor who exclude you, is from the in-group. I would like to know more about the dynamics within that.
Yeah. So that's again this idea, right? We are scratching the surface of understanding whether this autonomous response is also moderated or not.
Yes.
What I think we find in my research is that if you are excluded by an in-group, so an in-group is a group that's important to you, so let's call it mom, relative to an out-group, which would be your enemy, that the response is stronger. But to be honest, I think what we find is what we call a main effect. So basically people care more about being included by an in-group and care more about being excluded by an in-group. So it was not an interaction that we found. Overall people care more about in-groups. So within that setting, there is this effect of being included and excluded. But I'm not sure whether that effect was bigger than being excluded between an in-group, between an out-group and an inclusion. So basically, the effect, if you can see the camera, would be this in the in-group, so high, and this in the out-group. But look, it's the same effect. But overall, there is more activation here than there, but it's the same effect.
I see.
And I'm not sure whether we actually observed an interaction that the effect here was bigger and higher, and here lower.
But it's basically more activated. If I understand that correctly. And that is really interesting, because I feel like we can imagine, I imagine myself if I get excluded by my own in-group, for example, my family, the cues that I got would be much more stronger rather than just my like colleague in class. Probably I wouldn't really care that much.
Sure.
But when you are excluded or ignored by something that you hold dear, for example, you pick up the cues more accurate, not more accurately, but more often, if that makes sense, I think. And that is also brought me to my next point, because so far we are talking about the actor of social inclusion and the victims of social inclusion, while to my understanding, more often than not, social exclusion or social rejection and a lot of those cases is not a solitary action. Of course, it has to be like two actors, the actor and the victim, but more often than not, there is an observer. For example, well, I think we in our span of life have seen that someone is being rejected, for example, someone being ignored. So what I would like to ask and understand is the observer's reaction similar to the target's, and what does that say about human empathy?
So there's more and more research that takes the different perspectives. So you can look at the target, you can look at the source, those that do it, and you can look at those that observe and that are present.
Mm-hmm.
You can also look at observers that are not present.
Yeah.
So there are different roles, and the literature is progressing here. My initial hypothesis was that if you are the source, it's pain not moderated in the here and now, but moderated more delayed.
More delayed.
If you observe, to me, the hypothesis would be that's always a little bit more a delayed response. So the funny observation could be this, and there is actually some research on it. So if you ask sources, what is more painful? And they did this research in organizations.
Mm-hmm.
So they just asked, so you want to, quote, quote, punish your fellow employee. Should you ignore him, or should you tell negative things about him? Right? Be punitive in your attention or avoid attention.
Nice.
And the funny thing that research observed is that people apparently believe that to actively tell someone, I don't like you, is more hurtful than ignoring someone. But in that same research, they also replicated the research that I did by showing, and not only I, by the way, but many others, that when you ask targets what they dislike most, it's the other way around.
The ignorant part.
Yeah. So there is this mismatch. So apparently observers or sources believe that negative attention is worse than no attention.
Mm-hmm.
But those that experience it say the other way around. And that, I think, is something that we should realize, that if you are, because now I'm going to do it right, suppose that you are being ignored. Maybe your social band-aid there is the realization that the source actually thought that that would be nicer than telling you something negative. So you can also reverse the argument in that way, right? I already told you that we may misinterpret what is going on.
Yes.
So when we are being ignored, maybe it's just someone who tries to be nice to you.
Yeah.
Because he thought saying something negative to you would be worse.
Yeah.
And that, I think, is maybe also a solution when you think about being ignored or excluded, to rephrase it for yourself that maybe something else is going on.
I see. That is really, really interesting along the lines that we talk about that. And I also want to a little bit summarize what we talk about the physiological responses. And I do think that it is really, really interesting how there is a clear psychological and also physiological signals when our body is in the state of alarm, right? Because in your researches, it also activates more when it comes from your in-group as well. I think that's a really, really interesting point to be talked furthermore about. But I want to talk about a little something else, because it poses a question when your body basically is diverting its resources, its energy basically to that autonomous responses, there must be a cost paid somewhere else, right?
Yeah.
And we talk a lot about physiological. I really wanted to know, and I really wanted to look at the cognitive state of things, because when we are talking about that, we talk a lot about emotional pain as well. But beyond emotional pain, how does social exclusion impact our ability to think? Because there is also something that I found in your research, and I found that really interesting, that social exclusion could end up affecting your cognitive functions. And if you could explain more about that, please.
Yeah, well, what we did, and again, it was actually the same scholar, Paolini, that I did the research with. And he was able to investigate people, I think it was in Spain or in Italy, but that were homosexual, and they were excluded or not, and we compared it to like heterosexual males. And what goes on, because in that society, being homosexual is different than the norm. So if you are excluded and you're a heterosexual male, your sexuality is probably not part of the equation why you are excluded.
Yeah.
So you are excluded. But if you're homosexual, being excluded might be part of your thinking and related to the sexuality, that you start thinking like, wait a minute, am I now being excluded because I'm gay? And this conflict of reasons why you end up excluded is probably a bigger thing for minorities than for majority members. And as a consequence, we found and predicted that maybe because they are occupied with this reason why they cannot spend their resources on thinking through a short memory task. And what we observed is they had to recall words or something in a short memory task, that people that were gay were more affected by being excluded relative to being included than heterosexual males. And that was measured by this recall task testing short-term memory. And we saw that the gay men were more affected, more negatively affected by our manipulation than heterosexual males. Why? Well, we believe and we argued because they probably try to make sense of why they're excluded. And you should know that we didn't provide any reasons. So typically in this cyberball game, no reason is given, it just happens. And it then makes sense that people start to think about reasons. And when I think about this research, what pops up now, it's maybe not related, but I do want to say that. There's another puzzle. If you start making sense of why you're being excluded, we did some research, Tina Selig, and we had the question, maybe people sometimes think I'm excluded because I'm not good enough. So because of competence. Maybe people think I'm excluded because they don't like me. So because of warmth. And we thought these are two basic dimensions in which we characterize human behavior. and they are related to specific emotions.
I see.
So we indeed found that those individuals that believed that they were excluded because of their competence, they were angry. Whereas those individuals that believed that they were excluded because of they don't like me, warmth, they were sad. So it solved a puzzle. Because typically in research, we ask, how do you feel? And we see that it increases both anger and sadness.
I see.
But it's a little bit strange that it does both. And you should know that in research, this is an average across the entire group. And to make sense of that puzzle, we figured that maybe some of these individuals make sense because of competence, whereas others make sense because of warmth. And then it makes sense why some people are angry and others are sad, so that the average in the group is an increase in both sadness and group.
I see.
So, yeah.
And that is a really interesting point, because it comes to a distinction between how we feel those emotions as well and how we react to those emotions. And we are going to talk more about that, but I want to take a step back once again when we are talking about the cognitive cost, basically. And I want to reiterate what you explained that. So basically, because your researchers find that this particular finding about minority groups, they also felt more because it compared to for example, if we are using the heteronormative and the non-heteronormative, the LGBTQ groups, for the non-heteronormative, it gave them something more to think about, because when you are a heteronormative person, it didn't come to your mind basically that, oh, probably your sexual identity is why you are being excluded, right? And that, I think, is very, very interesting. And it does make sense, because we are running on resources, and when we don't have the resource, we tend to sacrifice something else. So in that sense, that we sacrifice our short-term memory, basically, to think more about the why we are excluded. And I want to ask about, because it begs the question, why the short-term memory? Why not the other cognitive function? Is there any mechanism behind that? Or is that just how it is supposed to be?
Well, I'm going to rephrase that a little bit, because many years ago, there was this idea of ego depletion. And ego depletion was the idea that the brain is like a muscle, and it can fatigue, and if it's fatigued, you cannot do something else.
Yes.
There's been done a lot of research on it, and in the last 10 years, they also have tried to organize replication studies to really test the core idea of ego depletion, which is, it's a muscle, the brain, it is fatigued, and it cannot perform something else after. It is fatigued. And there's no support anymore for that theory. So it's that the brain works like a muscle is wrong. That people can be fatigued is probably right, but it's probably more a motivational system. So your motivation to do something goes down. But the motivation can go up if you have proper incentives. So to give an example, it's one of the earliest studies that I did, and it's published in a Dutch little booklet. But basically, we turned to sources, and we tried to replicate an experiment that was done in a famous journal. And it goes like this. You instruct a participant, please ignore the other participant. So if the other participant starts talking to you, you cannot talk back. If the other participant seeks eye contact, you cannot look in its eyes. Or you are able to do whatever you want. So these are the two. Either you can include the other participants, or you need to avoid the other participant. And prior research has provided some evidence that people find this very difficult, and it led to ego depletion. So we wanted to replicate that. And how did they measure ego depletion? Well, people then had to solve unsolvable anagrams. They didn't know they were unsolvable. And then you can test how long do they take? How long do they endure? When do they give up? And this research showed that if you are told to ignore another individual, this is difficult for people because you can try it in a moment, and they then tried to solve these anagrams and they just gave up. So that was evidence for ego depletion in a way. I did a little twist. So I just told them, now you're going to do these anagrams for the person you just ignored. And people want to make up for their faux pas.
Yeah.
So they're really motivated. So now we showed that they actually worked really hard and long on these anagrams, showing that indeed the motivational approach is probably a better model than the muscle approach. So when I think about the gay minority angle, it could be that they were just less motivated to solve these tasks. I'm not sure whether it means that they couldn't because of the devotional resources. That is a slightly different interpretation. The consequence is the same. It would just mean that if maybe we would have said, you are going to do this task for your group and show them how smart your group is, maybe we would then have shown a different effect. We didn't do that, so we don't know, but then we would have had a different motivation for people. So whether it's really a conflict that cannot be resolved because you just don't have it, or whether it's just a conflict that lowers motivation, I think the latter part is probably a more correct interpretation of these type of findings.
I see. Yeah, that is interesting because it posits another question. Because, even though it comes in probably different form or by different reasons, but it does happen. The cognitive impairment by social exclusion does happen. And I mean, for someone who also sometimes experience social exclusion, it gets to me and it gets me worried that this cognitive impairment is a permanent thing, or is it like a short-term effect, or is it like persist? And I would like to know more about that because it worries me a lot. Because then the more that I get excluded, the more that I get rejected, does it mean that my cognitive being even more impaired, if that is the case? Hopefully not, but I would like to know more about that.
Well, what I just said, I said there's this difference between whether it's a motivational effect or whether it's really a cognitive decline effect. Personally, I would argue that in the short-term things that we do, these 10 minutes experiments, it's probably motivational. It just lowers your motivation to perform. If, however, you are in a prolonged situation of exclusion, so prolonged stress, and I mean prolonged, I mean weeks, months, I think your body does give in. You do get ill because that's basically prolonged stress. And prolonged stress on the body is just a bad thing. So the consequence of prolonged exclusion is probably the same consequence of prolonged stress on the body. And what prolonged stress on the body, that you should interview then a doctor, because he would know more than I would know, but that would be my suggestion here. So if I were you, don't worry if you're excluded. We are excluded all the time by different people. We are perfectly capable of regulating that. It probably lowers our motivation. It is painful. It lowers our motivation, but it also helps us to do something about it. So I think, to me, just ask yourself the question, is it correct, my perception that I'm being excluded? And I already told you, maybe it's not, because we are probably predisposed to over-detect. Second, realize that perhaps those that do ignore you do that because they wanted to be nice. And they they didn't want to offend you.
Yep.
So that's maybe good to know. And also realize that when you are coping with it, and maybe we're now going to touch on the scoping, there is this literature that thinks about what is then the dominant response.
Yeah.
But if you look in the literature, you should realize that often only one type of coping is assessed. And this is a very important observation, because if you only provide people one option and then show that people respond on that single option, maybe you have shown that people become nice, if that's the only option you give them. Or if you give them the only option to be nasty, maybe you have shown they become nasty. But to truly test whether people prioritize being nasty over being nice or the other way around, you should provide individuals both options. And Annelies Kip, so the CSA PhD candidate that defended her PhD, I think about 4 days ago, her dissertation was really about that. So what she did, she invented a paradigm where people had multiple options. So they can be good, they can be bad, or they can do nothing. And across several experiments where we provide these 3 options to people, we actually observe a replication of prior research. So if you compare inclusion to exclusion, people become less nice. If you compare inclusion to exclusion, people become more nasty. However, if you focus only on ostracism and you look at what people did, then the nice response dominated the nasty response. So yes, people become less nice, more nasty, but niceness dominates nastiness. So inherently, people, I would argue, behave in a pro-social way if they have this signal, you're out. And the other dominant response that we found is actually a lot of people just do nothing. And I think we touched that in the beginning of our talk. Like, why do people do nothing? Maybe the doing nothing helps you to make sense of what is going on. That you just sit back and think, okay, something's happening. And maybe the doing nothing is an adaptive response in 2 ways. First of all, it gives you time to assess, do I understand what is going on? And second of all, it may be a reaction that does not affect the source directly, and in such, it may not elicit the next response from the source. Dong-Ning Ren, she introduced this doing nothing, this withdrawal response, and she would be the next guest you should invite to talk more about that, because that's really her thing.
That is really interesting also, because now that we touch upon the coping as well, I would like to ask that then, is being doing nothing, is it the same thing as withdrawing into solitude? Because we touched about that a little bit. So I would like to have more clarity on it. Like, is it doing nothing about that is akin to withdrawing to solitude?
Well, in the research that I was involved in, we tried to make a distinction. So we gave people the option just to do nothing, or we gave people the option to do nothing with the connotation that it would really be withdrawal. So to do something on your own. And we observed similar findings. So regardless of whether we framed the do nothing as just not being aggressive, of not being nice, but do nothing as now you're going to do something on your own. It's kind of like a similar pattern. So to me, that suggests that they share similar properties. So apparently, those people that do nothing, some of them are actually people that would have liked to withdraw, but we didn't give them that option because they just would do nothing. Or the other way around. If you give them the option to withdraw, there are probably also people in that group that actually just wanted to do nothing, but that's then for them the way to do nothing, just to be out of the situation.
I see. Yeah. That is really interesting. So now that we have the key differences basically about all of those responses, right? And I would like to a little bit reel back towards what we talk about, that there is a distinction prior about the emotion that we are feeling or the reaction that we are giving when we are, for example, excluded, rejected, ostracized by because we are incompetent. We mentioned about that previously. That we become aggressive when we are rejected or excluded because of the warmth. We become sad. I would like to delve more on what's the psychological mechanism behind it. Like, is it like inherently because we are told we are incompetent, we get angry, or is there any more deeper that it goes?
So initially, when you look at the model of Kip Williams, this temporal model, it argues that ostracism is unique in that it threatens a couple of fundamental needs that are important to people. So the obvious one is belonging. So it lowers your sense of belonging and thus increases your need to belong. The second thing that it does is that it lowers your self-esteem. Thus, in other words, it increases your need to regain self-esteem.
I see.
It also lowers your sense of control. Thus, it increases your need to control the world again. It also lowers your sense of meaning. The world has meaning. Thus, it should increase your need for meaning. So these four needs are affected when you are left out. And why is this interesting? Because Leary and Baumeister, but Leary, they argue that self-esteem and belonging is a cluster. So those that have low self-esteem are actually telling, I don't belong. They actually say it's a thermometer. So the extent to which people indicate they have high or low self-esteem is a direct proxy of whether these people actually believe they belong to a group or not. So this is separate research. The control and meaning is interesting because that is actually tied to making sense of the world and regain control. Now, why are these two things interesting, these two clusters? The model assumes the most adaptive thing to do when you're excluded is to do something nice. Because if you do something nice, you will regain inclusion.
Yes.
And if you regain inclusion, you regain belonging, self-esteem, control, and meaning, all four. But what happens is that inclusion needs to be given to you. I cannot claim it. If I do something nice to you, you ignored me, and I have a present for you. You ignored me, here's a present. You do not take the present. I need you to accept my niceness. So the model would then assume that if you do not accept my niceness, so I need you to do that, then I cannot regain belonging, I cannot regain self-esteem, control, and meaning. So there's another route that I can take that does work on control and meaning.
I see.
If I simply slap you in the face, I don't need your acceptance for that. So to do something nasty, you do not need the other individual to accept that. In other words, if I start hitting you, deny that, deny that. So with that, I do regain control and meaning. And so the model would assume people should probably prioritize pro-social behavior, but that needs to be granted. If that does not succeed, then maybe people become nasty. Because that will afford at least some form of control and meaning. Or to put it to the extreme, suppose you are a high school kid and you're being ignored on school and disliked. And you've tried. You've tried to adjust your clothing. You've tried to adjust all kinds of stuff, but they keep on ignoring you. In some of the diaries of those children that go on a killing spree, start shooting, they do find hints that these children felt very excluded. And maybe this ultimate aggressive explosion did regain a sense of control and meaning for them. Or put differently, and that's something else that I sometimes find worrying, if I'm excluded here in this university and I try to be nice and I succeed, nobody would notice. If I try to be nice and it doesn't succeed, nobody would notice. But if I, as a full professor, would kill 4 students here, it would be world news. The entire world would know my existence. So in that sense, it provides a mean to belong on a very negative way.
Extreme as well.
And very extreme. But maybe I regain also then a sense of belonging. Like deny this if I do that. So that's something at the extreme ironic. The ironic part is that sometimes being nasty actually increases a sense of belonging then. But I don't think it's the first thing that we do. And it's extremely rare, and that's why it also makes the news. Right. In the news, we read about extreme rare events.
And I do think that, I do also agree that it's not something that we do or think first to be nasty as a response, because as you said that time and time again, and I think that we understand that we are social animals and we want to have a good social relationship with others, so it's not our first thought to be nasty. And we touch a lot about that, about the feeling of what you explained about being nasty and being nice, and how that when being nice stop giving us the control back, we kind of, not always and hopefully not so extreme, shifted toward the nasty things. But the thing that I want to know is, I do think it means that we have to create an environment in that same environment where being nice without having to be nasty could basically be the solution towards the exclusion. But to make that environment itself is going to be a challenge. And if so, is there any step, for example, for a group that want to make an inclusive, for example, environment for people to be more nice, for example, for their responses?
For me, what I think is that if you compare systems, some systems, groups overlap. So that means that if you are excluded from the group, you're excluded from everything. Other systems, groups do not overlap. So we have multiple groups. So if you are excluded from one group, you may be included in the other group. So to me, I would argue or believe, I don't have evidence for that, I'm not a sociologist, so I haven't tested, but I would assume that the consequences of being excluded in systems where groups overlap are more severe than systems where groups do not overlap. So in other words, In the USA system of schools, high school is also where you do your sports, and also where you do your music. So basically, it's your life. So if you're excluded from high school, you're excluded, I think, from a large portion of your life.
Yeah.
In the Netherlands, most people, their sports club is completely different than their school. So they have friends at school and they have friends at their sports club, like playing soccer. And I would imagine that belonging to